So everybody, thank you for joining today's webinar, The Easy Guide to Non-GMO Project Verification. Today we'll provide an overview of the verification process, describing the basic documentation requirements, and we'll highlight some key concepts that will help to get you started. The intention is that after today's webinar, you'll have a good idea of what to expect when deciding to pursue non-GMO project verification, and that you'll understand the basic fundamentals of the non-GMO project standard. In the coming months, we'll be providing more product or process-specific webinars that dive a little bit deeper into the standard requirements as they pertain to certain types of production systems or operations. So be sure to check back on our website regularly for an agenda of upcoming events. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So to begin, let's just take a high-level overview at the verification process, which can be summarized in 5 distinct steps: requesting verification from SCS, completing the program application documents, the non-GMO project compliance audit itself, obtaining the audit report, and for all eligible products, your verification certificate, and maintaining compliance by way of annual monitoring and the annual compliance audit. For those who have completed our organic certification or other identity preservation type audits, this process should be quite familiar to you. So getting started, the first order of business is to request verification from SCS Global Services. You'll be asked to provide basic information such as listing all products that you want to evaluate, all ingredients in those products, and how many facilities are involved in production. SCS will provide a quote for your verification fees, an estimated time to complete the audit, and identify areas where GMO risk may occur. Upon signing your work order and executing the program contract, you'll be provided with a customized packet of verification profile forms that are tailored to your type of operation. And at that point, you're now ready to start working towards your non-GMO project verification. So what you see here is a list of the basic forms that essentially all operations are going to need to complete as part of your verification audit. The program application provides basic participant and product information. The ingredient declarations request some key details about the composition of your ingredients and provide for the evaluation of each ingredient and their components for GMO risk. The facility profile discloses facility information, locations, and information about the products that are handled there and the steps that are taken to mitigate GMO risk. The traceability and quality management profile forms detail the participants' quality and identity preservation systems, and the package information profile will track all the various containers and packages and so forth that your compliant products are packed into. So now what we're going to do is take a closer look at what information is going to need to be provided and that you'll need to have available to successfully complete each of these forms and provide the supporting documentation required. So we'll go ahead and get started by looking at your ingredients. The ingredient declaration forms really provide SCS and your auditor with an understanding of where GMO risk within your inputs might occur. So this means that within every ingredient, we're going to be looking at mono inputs. So the verification process really takes place at the mono input level. So what a mono input really is a single ingredient component. You'll have a compound ingredient, which is one that is made of multiple components or inputs, versus a mono or simple ingredient that only has a single component. And it's each of those mono inputs that we're going to be evaluating for GMO risk. So I'm just going to back up one slide here. And if you look at this ingredient statement on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll identify some mono inputs in this product, such as wheat germ. That's a single component ingredient, versus the first ingredient is flour, which contains wheat flour, malted barley flour, niacin, reduced iron, thiamine mononitrate, riboflavin, and folic acid. That flour would be considered a compound input, and the wheat flour or the barley flour within that input would be considered a mono input. So for the purposes of clarity and terminology, typically when we're referring to an input either in this presentation or in our forms, we're usually referring to a mono input. So now what we're going to do is look at some of the requirements for evaluating your inputs based on risk. And I see that there is some questions coming in right now, and again, I'll have everyone kind of hold off on their questions until the end of this slideshow, and I'm going to do my best to get to all those in the allotted time frame. If there are any questions at the end that remain unanswered, we'll provide you with an email address, and we'll make sure that everybody is followed up with individually to make sure that any of your questions are answered. So forgive me if you're answering questions right now. Just know that that answer should be forthcoming later on in the presentation. So looking at non-risk inputs, which would be things that are not agriculturally derived, SCS is going to evaluate the specification sheet of those types of inputs to confirm absence of any components that may present risk for GMOs. So a good example to look at here is salt. Pure sea salt is itself non-risk. It's a mineral product. There's no agricultural component, no risk for GMOs, versus an iodized salt, which is obviously fortified with iodine, does present a risk for GMOs. So that's an example of what might be perceived as a non-risk input that does have some factor of GMO risk. Looking at low-risk inputs, which are inputs for which GMO versions have not been commercialized and that have no incidence of contamination. In addition to evaluating all the components of your low-risk inputs, we're just going to ensure that the production and the handling of such inputs is conducive to maintaining its low-risk status. So high-risk inputs are those for which GMO varieties are commercially produced in North America and beyond, and includes all animal products and their derivatives, and we'll get into that a little bit more later on. Evaluation of high-risk inputs is where much of the rigor of the verification audit actually takes place. Compliance of such inputs with the non-GMO project standard is carefully monitored for each input from procurement through the production process to the finished product, finished goods actually being evaluated. The non-GMO project standard requires that participants use, when they are available, non-GMO project verified forms of high-risk inputs. That makes the production and the evaluation process much easier for a formulator, say, because high-risk inputs have already been vetted and have already been approved and can basically be reclassified as low risk. Being that they've already completed an audit for the input. If verified forms of high-risk inputs are not available, compliance is demonstrated as is shown here. So as you can see, the way that high-risk inputs are evaluated depends on how they are formulated in a finished product. So if a high-risk input is itself a finished product, corn, soy, raw agricultural commodity, say, or a major ingredient, which comprises 5% or more of your finished product formulation, if a non-GMO project verified certificate is unavailable, participants are going to be doing genetic testing, which includes PCR testing from approved labs and a statistically valid sampling plan. It is through genetic testing that these major ingredients can be demonstrated on a consistent basis to be absent for GMO risk. So for minor ingredients, which are those that comprise less than 5% of a product by formulation, again, compliance can be demonstrated always through a non-GMO project verified certificate for that input. GMO testing and sampling, of course, or for these products, if they're a product of a system designed to avoid GMOs, such as organic certification or another identity preservation certification type program that has GMO avoidance built into it, then traceability back to a certificate, say an identity preservation certificate or organic certificate, in many cases can be used to demonstrate compliance for these minor ingredients. And then we get to micro ingredients, which oftentimes are where GMO risk can occur, but these are ingredients that are relatively small, less than 0.5% by formulation of the finished product. The non-GMO project standard does build in some exemptions for these type of ingredients on a limited basis. So many may be exempt, others require documentation demonstrating that there are no viable microbes, no functional enzymes or direct products of GMO microorganisms or products of synthetic biology. And in many cases, when you're working with your ingredient suppliers, you'll find that those suppliers are going to want to be protective sometimes of their information and their proprietary formulations. So in such cases, if you're having a hard time getting disclosure from your ingredient suppliers of the information that you need, SCS can work with them directly to achieve direct disclosure of the information that we need under the protection of a non-disclosure agreement if your suppliers are requesting that. So now turning our attention from inputs to other key components of the verification program application, we're going to look at the facility profile. And participants may own their facilities or they may use contract manufacturers, otherwise known as co-processors. And if you're using a co-processor, it's important that the participant maintains a close enough working relationship with the facility because they're going to be expected to disclose some key information about their handling practices, their traceability system, how inputs are identified and segregated from high GMO risk inputs through the facility, and so forth. We'll need disclosure of all activities that take place at the facility, such as agricultural production, handling, processing, distribution, etc. And information about all the kinds of inputs that are handled at the facilities. So facilities that handle high GMO risk inputs are going to require a little bit more rigorous traceability systems and identity preservation systems to ensure that compliance of an input through their processing system can be maintained and demonstrated as part of the audit. So providing SCS with information about traceability and quality management enables us to evaluate how non-GMO project compliance status of your inputs is maintained through production. So each lot of each input must be able to be traced forward through the production into the lots of finished goods and vice versa. So from finished goods back to the individual lots that were used as ingredients or processing aids. Compliance with the non-GMO project standard must be specifically addressed in the operations written procedures, so in your SOPs and so forth, and they need to serve as a key quality indicator of the participants' products. So participants who are engaged in organic certification, say, or a food safety certification program, you're going to be familiar with a lot of these concepts, and in most cases, your existing procedures can be modified quite easily to accommodate this requirement. It's very rare to almost never that you're having to completely reinvent a traceability system, especially if you already have one in place for organic certification or a food safety program where lot control recall audits and so forth are commonplace. So quality and compliance monitoring must be sufficient to effectively monitor for GMO contamination at critical control points throughout the production process. So that's including GMO testing of high-risk inputs as necessary where required, and other issues previously discussed, such as traceability, segregation, and so forth. And we'll look a little bit more closely at that concept in just a few minutes in a future slide here. So moving on, we're going to look at the package information that all verified products are actually packaged into. One, SCS will need to do a review of your product labels, use of the non-GMO project logo, and so forth to ensure that the logo use is within the requirements of the non-GMO project. And we also just need to know what are the brand names that your products are sold under. How are the products themselves named and identified? How many different package sizes, package types are used, UPC codes, SKUs, and so forth, as well as information about the markets, especially the countries really where the products are sold. Currently, the non-GMO project logo is recognized and eligible to be displayed within the United States and Canada, and on a very limited basis in some other markets, but those are evaluated kind of on a case-by-case basis. But in all cases, it's required that your products are by and large primarily sold within the United States and Canada if they're carrying the non-GMO project logo. So following the submission of all your verification profiles and supporting documentation to SCS, we're going to conduct a detailed compliance audit of your products, of their inputs, and of your production system. So in some cases, your auditor may need to request additional information, usually specific information about your inputs and or attestation from your ingredient or input suppliers that confirm the absence of GMO risk. So that will include the composition of those inputs and the conditions under which they are produced, just to evaluate that there's no possibility that GMO cross-contamination could happen or commingling with non-compliant inputs and so forth. In some cases, it might be necessary to revise formulations or seek alternative sources of inputs if compliance cannot be demonstrated for all the inputs that are used. And as I mentioned previously, it is pretty common that ingredient suppliers are going to want to be protective of some of this information, and in a lot of cases, SCS will be working directly with your ingredient suppliers to obtain direct disclosure of that information, again, under the protection of an NDA, basically. Facilities are evaluated for the sufficiency of the systems that are in place to maintain integrity of compliant inputs. And a traceability audit is conducted to ensure that identity preservation systems can effectively demonstrate the compliance of all inputs through the production system. So again, that is lot control of incoming ingredients and inputs, and their traceability such that via your lot coding system, they can be traced forward. Looking at a certain input, you can identify which lots of finished goods that input went into, and then vice versa. So looking again from finished goods back through the production system into the individual component lots of the inputs that were used in the production process. So a pretty standard trace forward and trace back exercise, much the same as you'll have to do for a food safety or an organic certification audit. So at the completion of your audit, all participants are going to be provided with an audit report that summarizes the findings of the audit. So if no non-compliances are found, participants are going to receive a certificate of compliance for all eligible products. So it may be the case if you're evaluating multiple products that most of them are demonstrated as compliant, and there might be a case where one or two of them might have some issues with the ingredients or the inputs that are used that still need to be resolved. So at the completion of the audit, all eligible products will be added to your certificate. So it's not all or nothing. You know, in some cases, there are some products that we will continue to work on with participants to get what we need to add those products basically to the scope of the certification at a later date. So again, I am seeing some questions filter in here, and I know that some people may have joined late, and just to reemphasize, but I will get to your questions at the end of the show here. We'll have about 20 minutes, 25 minutes to look at these questions in a little bit further detail, and I'll be responding to those using the chat feature. So please do try to have a little bit of patience, and I'll do my best to get to all your questions. So if non-compliances are identified during the course of your audit, most of them are correctable, and all will be summarized again in the audit report. And the audit report is going to include the key information that's shown on this slide. So information about where the nonconformity itself occurred. Was it an issue with an input? Was it with a documentation requirement? Or was it something in the process, such as insufficient segregation of inputs, say? It'll also include the specific requirements or the specific sections of the non-GMO project standard that are not being met, and it'll have a specific time frame that's required for resolution. So all non-compliances, you will be given an opportunity to correct them, and typically that time frame for resolution is 30 days following the issuance of the audit report. So for any non-compliances, participants will submit a corrective actions plan and evidence of implementation of that corrective action. And once compliance is demonstrated, or once all non-compliances have been resolved, at that point the certificate will be issued. So now looking at monitoring for compliance in between audit cycles and your annual renewal. So in between audit cycles, participants must monitor their own production systems to ensure ongoing compliance with the non-GMO project standard requirements. SCS must be notified of any changes to the production system, including sourcing inputs from a different supplier, or changing inputs, or changing formulations, or anything that could really have bearing on compliance status of the finished product that's being evaluated. Critical control points will need to be monitored to ensure absence of GMO risk by way of inputs, commingling, cross-contamination, or otherwise. And monitoring shall require implementation of the key concepts previously discussed, such as traceability, segregation, lot control, and testing at critical points through the production system where required. Non-compliances, if identified by the participant via your monitoring system, shall trigger corrective actions, and they need to be reported to SCS within an established time frame. Major non-compliances require timely root cause analysis and evidence of successful implementation. So major non-compliances would be things such as evidence of cross-contamination, evidence of commingling, or anything that could affect the compliance status of the finished product. Those do need to be resolved quickly with the root cause analysis, and again, evidence of successful implementation within a pretty tight time frame to maintain verification. And minor non-compliances would be things such as small documentation issues, etc., that don't necessarily have any bearing on the compliance status of the finished product. Minor non-compliances will be reviewed at the annual renewal. So in the months, really in the few weeks leading up to the annual renewal, which is established based on the issue date of your certificate, leading up to the anniversary date of the issuance of your certificate, SCS will send out a renewal packet, a renewal form, will request any updates that you've made to your systems that have not already been reported, and the audit process basically starts over again. So now that we've looked at the overview of the application, the profile forms, and the audit process, we'll take a quick look at some of the key concepts associated with genetic testing and GMO risk. So genetic testing, again, is required for all producers of high-risk crops, so that's your corn, your soy, your cotton, alfalfa, and so forth. Dairy and livestock producers. So the reason that all dairy and livestock products are considered high risk is because the feed that the animals are consuming may contain and frequently contain high-risk inputs, as do some of the antibiotics, hormones, and so forth that are given to the animals. So testing for dairy and livestock products obviously cannot be done on the animals themselves, but on the feed that they consume. And processors that use high-risk inputs as major ingredients or as minor ingredients that are not certified organic or part of another IP system designed to avoid GMOs, for those kinds of inputs, genetic testing will need to be conducted as well. And the table here shows what we call action thresholds, and that's basically the maximum allowable amount of detectable GMO material in a given sample. So action thresholds are established to account for things such as incidental contamination, genetic drift, and so forth. So the action thresholds can vary depending on the kind of product that we're evaluating. So if we're looking at seed or planting stock propagation materials, the action threshold is 0.25% genetic material. For human food, anything that's consumed by people, as well as anything that's used directly on the skin, so personal care products, lotions, soaps, and so forth, the action threshold is 0.9%. Animal feed, it is 5%, and then for packaging, cleaning materials, textiles, and other products that are eligible for verification but that are not ingested, that are not used in skin, the action threshold is a little bit higher at 1.5%. And so your testing must demonstrate consistently that the inputs used are testing below these action thresholds. So in the coming months, we'll get into a little bit more detail in some future webinars, diving a little bit deeper into genetic testing and some scope-specific items as they pertain to non-GMO project verification. So understanding where GMO risk comes from, obviously, is very important here. So for crop producers, GMO risk really comes from the cultivation of GMO varieties of crops. So you're looking at your alfalfa, your canola, your corn, cotton, soy, sugar beets, papaya, zucchini, and yellow squash. Those really are your crops that are at high risk for GMOs that are commercially produced on a large scale here in the United States. So producers of these types of crops will be doing statistically valid sampling and testing of their product to ensure that they are consistently testing below the action thresholds that were identified on the previous slide. Looking at livestock and dairy products, GMO risk, as I previously had discussed, comes from feed components. So a lot of times these animals are eating feed that's derived from corn, or they might have components of soy, sometimes even sugar components that may be derived from sugar beets and so forth in supplemental feed that have risk for GMOs, as well as vaccines, hormones, and so forth that are used in the animals. So we'll need disclosure of all the components of the feed, ensuring that the high-risk components of the feed that the animals consume are tested consistently below the action threshold. So, for example, if you're a producer of a yogurt product, you will need to go back to the actual farms, to the actual dairies that are providing the base for the yogurt and doing genetic testing, lot-by-lot testing of the feed that the animals are consuming. And for your processed or multi-ingredient types of products, anything that's going to be in a bag, in a box, on a store shelf, and so forth, the easily identified high-risk inputs, such as corn and their derivatives, corn syrup, ethanol, molasses that might be derived from sugar beets, soy protein, and so forth, dairy inputs, that's where GMO risk, by and large, is coming from in processed products, as well as usually as micro-ingredients, things like sweeteners, artificial and natural flavors, acids, ascorbic acid, amino acids, citric acid, vegetable protein, soy protein, enzymes, microbial inputs, vitamins, stabilizers, additives, all these things usually that are the bottom half of the ingredient statement, the hard to pronounce ingredients, the ingredients that are very long and a little bit complex and hard to understand. Things that are indicative of a little bit more highly processed product tend to have more GMO risk just because of the way that they're produced or the agricultural components that they're derived from. A surprising amount of corn, sugar beets, soy, etc. can be used in things like substrates and can be used as a source material through processing into some of these other types of processing aids and so forth. So now some helpful resources that are really important to know of if you're going for non-GMO project verification. First would be the non-GMO project website itself is a wealth of information. It is there where you can find the non-GMO project standard. So that is the set of requirements that all products, all production systems, all participants are evaluated to, and that transcends scopes from livestock to dairy to raw agricultural commodities to processed goods and so forth. It's a standard set of regulations that everybody needs to be demonstrated to be compliant with. And that's publicly available, of course, on the non-GMO project website, or you can reach out to SCS and we're happy to provide it to you as well. They also have a really nice resource, which is the non-GMO project verified products database. So that's not only where consumers can look up finished products and suppliers of non-GMO project verified finished products. Certainly that is a useful component of the database, but also for, say, a formulator or manufacturer of a formulated product. Every verified participant in the products that they have that have been demonstrated eligible for non-GMO project verification are listed in this database. So sometimes it's a really good resource for finding sources of non-GMO project verified inputs. So as I mentioned previously, part of the standard requirement is that if non-GMO project verified inputs are available, that they should be used. That really does make the non-GMO project verification process itself a lot easier if you're using sources of high-risk inputs that have already been evaluated and have already been demonstrated as compliant, because that then takes the burden of demonstrating compliance off of you, since that's already been done. They also have a list of approved laboratories for genetic testing. So for PCR testing, it is required that you're using a non-GMO project approved laboratory, that they hold ISO 17025 accreditation for the methods that they're using, and we need to ensure that the methods that they use cover all possible genetic events for the type of input that they're testing. Another really great resource or set of resources that can be found on their website is guidance on sampling, statistical sampling. So GIPSA and GAFTA guidelines have been established mostly for the seed and grain sampling industry, but it is sampling that applies to all types of products, and it really does break down what statistical sampling looks like for testing for compliance. Another really good resource out there is the Non-GMO Sourcebook. It's an online database and information on suppliers and sources of non-GMO products and inputs. And it also has articles about current events, about non-GMO products and inputs and things that should be of interest to most people that are going for non-GMO project verification. And another interesting resource is GMO Compass. And that's just news, subject spotlights, editorials, and things pertaining to non-GMO project verification. So knowing what these resources can provide and knowing how to use them really can kind of demystify a little bit of the process and provide really good resources for you as you decide to go for non-GMO project verification. SCS also has made a guide for participants that really does go a little bit deeper into some of the verification requirements, some frequently asked questions, and kind of specifics about how to navigate the audit process and things that participants can do to prepare themselves for the audit, to set themselves up for success.